Thank you all for coming this evening, and I'm sure everybody's had a long, busy day, and so I'm grateful that you made time to come this evening. And I went through, Liz shared with me your advanced goals and challenges when teaching these materials. I looked through those. I also looked through the state standards. And so I'm hopeful that what I have to say tonight will be beneficial to some of the needs that you expressed in your comments, and will, help with the state history standards. Okay, so we will have time for Q&A later on, but if something occurs to you, in the pre-dawn hours as you're planning your day tomorrow, or a month from now, or, a year from now, there's my email. Liz and her team will share all of the slides with you. So if you have questions later on, you can absolutely ask me. So I know that everyone who teaches social studies in the state of Texas has to do instruction for Celebrate Freedom Week. I know that there is a jumping in this charge over the Articles of Confederation. They are not mentioned, but they, in this particular language, but they are essential to understanding this era of the 4 webinars. And the articles are the vital historical context for and the specific historical link between the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights. But before I get into all of that, let's begin with a little bit of mindfulness. First of all, about chronology. We have condensed in our minds often the Revolutionary era as if it's a particular period, but 25 years passed between the first organized opposition to British imperial policies in the early 1760s and the creation of the Constitution in the late 1780s. The Revolutionary War, in the middle of that, raged for over 8 years, twice as long as the American Civil War. It was a little more than 15 years between the Declaration of Independence in July of 1776 and the ratification of the Bill of Rights in December of 1791. So I think we all know from our recent history that a lot can happen in 15 years. A lot can change and change again and change back again, and so on and so forth. 15 years is longer than most of your students' lives. To the TEAC standard of understanding the key founding era text in their context, I want us to be mindful too about the distinction between the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. The Declaration included broad assertions about somewhat abstract rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We should never forget that a critical part of the historical context of understanding the Declaration is that some people enjoyed liberty and happiness while controlling the lives of others, and who could enjoy those or aspire to those abstract rights was circumscribed by class, by gender, and especially by race. So that's the kind of document is fundamentally different than the 1791 Bill of Rights, which provided a specific list of legal constitutional rights, but with the same historical context that some people, property-owning white man, enjoyed rights, and some people, most egregiously African Americans held in bondage, were denied those rights. And the fourth of these conversations that you all be having will be with Charlie Flanagan, and he's going to take a deep dive into the Declaration. There is an often forgotten but critical link between these two widely emphasized documents, and that is the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was passed in June of 1776 and drafted by George Mason. I have a link if you're listening while walking or making dinner, that's perfectly fine. But I'm dropping in links on many of these slides in response to the hope that you all might gain access to more materials for your own teaching. So if you want to look back through the slides, this is the first one that has a link to a document. So the Virginia Declaration of Rights, again, crafted by George Mason in 1776. Thomas Jefferson borrowed from Mason for the Declaration of Independence with those sweeping claims about universal rights. And James Madison borrowed from George Mason when he crafted the specific list within the Bill of Rights for the Constitution. Remembering those links leads us toward better appreciating the significance, which is often overlooked, of state governments in the 1770s and the early 1780s. Virginia was not the only state to draft a Bill of Rights in the 1770s. In fact, creating a list of citizens' rights that governments could not violate was central to the state making that went on across North America in the early years of the Revolutionary War. It was in those states that most people believed their rights and their responsibilities lay. And it was in the states that most people imagined their identities rested. They invested in their state governments. Again, that's their focus in the 1770s. They invested in those state governments necessary limited powers to reflect the will of citizens without violating the rights of citizens. State constitutions designed mostly in 1775 and 76 were highly decentralized and highly responsive to voters. They were truly limited governments. And I know that's a state standard to think about limited government in the context of the Constitution. But in fact, the proper historical context for understanding limited government does not center on the Constitution. Many people in 1787 imagined that the Constitution created a distant, centralized national government, elaborate in design, and dangerously unlimited. Instead, limited government was in the states, in their state constitutions, and in the Articles of Confederation. So I'm going to double back in a little bit and talk some more about the states, but I want to return to our central focus now, and that's the Articles of Confederation. So in retrospect, we can look back and list the strengths and the weaknesses of the short-lived Articles of Confederation. That's part of your state standards too. And that's where we'll start in our document discussion, thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of the articles. But spoiler alert, from the 21st century point of view, it's a lot easier to list the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation than it is to list the strengths. The weaknesses are numerous and self-evident, and the strengths are difficult sometimes to find. In fact, we might ask ourselves, in considering from the 21st century, the strengths and weaknesses of the Articles, how could smart people have made such a bad series of decisions? What were the founders thinking with the Articles of Confederation? That, I think, is an excellent question. And answering it can teach our students some important history, some important historical thinking skills, and it offers them opportunities for reimagining our government today. If we look from the Revolutionary era forward, rather than from 2023 backwards, that is, if we're good historians trying to understand the past on its own terms, then we can see that the Articles were a logical, reasonable system of government, given the recent history that the designers of the Articles had experienced. So 1763 to 1781, that context, makes the Articles very logical. And what we today think of as weaknesses, we can see that people at the time would have thought of as strengths. So the history behind the Articles, the 1760s and 1770s, is very complex. And you all know it requires a lot of nuance and appreciation of multiple perspectives. But I'm going to quickly tell you about those years from the singular but culturally powerful point of view of leading patriots. So this, which I'm about to tell you, is what growing numbers of North Americans came to believe was true and acted on when making their governments, state governments, and the Articles of Confederation. Again, these are the perceptions, but they're shaping the reality. Beginning in the mid-1760s, imperial leaders in London adopted policy innovations damaging to the North Americans and in violation of their rights as English subjects. In particular, Britain imposed new taxes to which the colonists did not consent. And when the colonists resisted, Britain sent troops in to enforce its will. Sometimes, as in Boston in 1770, the corruption of a distant, entrenched power tyrannizing colonial subjects turned deadly. After crippling the economy, undermining representative democracy, dismantling trial by jury, and pivoting toward martial law with the coercive acts, when law-abiding, liberty-loving North Americans could bear no more, a war broke out. A year plus into that armed conflict, to defend English rights against imperial corruption, the North Americans decided the problem was the entire British system, starting with hereditary monarchy, so that the revolt against policy became a revolution on behalf of representative government. Citizens, not monarchs, should and would best govern. It was just, as Tom Paine said, common sense. So throughout all of this story that patriot leaders told themselves over and over and over again, the through line to it was profound and deepening fear of distant, centralized power. Power, the 18th century American elites understood, was corruptive and antithetical to liberty. Now, they also understood that too much liberty was corruptive as well, but in the 1770s, that's a far less concern than too much power. You'll have to wait for the Constitution and what Joe's going to talk about to see the scales begin to tip in the opposite direction, fear of liberty. Now, the most pressing specific matter related to the excessive powers of Britain was the rallying cry of radicalizing North Americans, and that is no taxation without representation. Their property was being taken without their consent, and they would do without, boycott, destroy the taxed goods, riot in the streets, and go to war before they would pay unjust taxes, before they would allow their property to be taken without their consent by a corrupt, distant, centralized power. And that story, again, that's a story, that's not the facts, but that story, which people believed, is the background to understanding the creation of and the structures in the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles, just so we're all clear on the specific details, were adopted by the Continental Congress in November of 1777, finally accepted by the states in 1781, and in force until the Constitution went into effect in March of 1789. And these are what we might call the rules of the road for the Articles of Confederation. It's a confederacy. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. There are some expressly delegated authorities that go to the Congress, but otherwise the states are in a firm league of friendship. It's really an alliance, a defensive alliance of independent, sovereign states, so that the United States there is plural, not singular. And I've got a link in this slide as well, so if you want to read more about the Articles, though we'll do some of that in our discussion as well. So the Congress's structure was, its powers were limited to a handful of duties: running a post office, engaging in international diplomacy on behalf of the Allied states, declaring war on foreign nations. The Confederation Congress could not do what the British government had done that has so aggrieved the patriots. It could not undermine the sovereignty of state elective governments, and it could not tax the citizens. The Congress's structure was set up to militate against, and I've said this many times because it's very important, distant, centralized power. There was no chief executive, no one to possibly act like a tyrannical, royally appointed colonial governor or a king, no central judiciary, strict term limits, and strict rotation of office. And this was all very logical given the historical context in theory, but it proved problematic in practice. So this is a slide that I use sometimes for discussion with students. We're going to come back to it in our documents discussion. But the evolution of the concept of representation was one of the central issues that was debated in the Revolutionary period. I think the central issue in state making in both the states and under the Articles of Confederation, we're still arguing about what is a fair and appropriate system of representation in the 21st century. And the way that representation was redefined under the Constitution was one of the most significant and controversial innovations in the design, because it was a reversal of practices in the states and under the Articles of Confederation. Okay. So public perceptions and textbooks often cast the Constitution as a remedy for the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation, right? So we can list all the problems with the Articles, and the Constitution is going to come in and fix all of that. And to be certain, there were widespread, legitimate frustrations with the Articles from the very outset of its implementation. The very limited nature of congressional powers meant that the Confederation Congress could not fulfill even its very narrow listed duties. It could not pay bills, including soldiers' pensions, and that threatened societal uprisings. It could not successfully negotiate with foreign governments, which raised the very real fear of an invasion of the plural United States. James Madison's plan for a roadmap of the Philadelphia Convention in 1787 tells you exactly what he thinks with the title. He called it Vices of the Political System of the United States. Among the many vices that Madison included was the impotence of the Confederation Congress, inability to collect requisitions and pay bills, lack of control over commerce, and the lack of a central judiciary, and in general, what he characterized as the lack of coercive power over the states. So he wrote about all of that. But the dominant theme of vices of the political system of the United States was not the structural defects of the Articles of Confederation, but what he called the injustices of the laws of the states. So let me return back to the state. I've got an image of the Constitution of Pennsylvania, which was created in 1776, a link to Yale Law School's Avalon Project, which has the text of all of the 75, 76 state constitutions, if you'd like to take a deeper dive. But remember that those states are where patriots invested their identity and thought their rights would be preserved. Besides having bills of rights written into those state constitutions, all of them required annual elections to serve in office, as did the Articles of Confederation. All of them imposed term limits on elective officials, as did the Articles of Confederation. Most of the powers under the state constitutions were invested in the elected legislatures. Now, they did have, most of them had governors and upper houses, but it was with the elected the elected legislative bodies where power resided. Again, very similar to the Articles of Confederation. And these shared structures kept representatives close to and responsive to voters. They worked against the corruptive influences of distant centralized power. So remember the history, and you can appreciate the logic of these structures. Now, many historians conclude that it was the successes of the state legislatures that worried elites and experienced politicians at least as much as the failings of the Articles of Confederation. That was certainly the case with James Madison. Long before the violence of Shays' Rebellion in 1786, democratic politics that empowered farmers and debtors stoked elite anxiety. As the first state constitutions gave the lion's share of authority to annually elected, term-limited legislators, those farmers and artisans also began to reject the politics of deference. And instead of deferring to the so-called better sort, electing the wealthy, powerful gentlemen of their communities, they began to elect representatives from among their own ranks, who shared their own priorities, and pass laws that reflected the needs and benefited the interest of their constituents. Experienced and elite politicians came to believe that these democratically driven legislatures pursued short-sighted, counterproductive policies rooted in parochialism and popular whim. They decided that there were just too many rights in the states, too many voices, and too little governmental power. Just a New Yorker cartoon to break up the evening. Citizens, it turned out, didn't care too much for paying taxes or debts generally, regardless of the representational structure. And as the new nation struggled economically, their interest waned further. So that the excesses of democracy didn't just worsen the economic crises of the 1780s, although they certainly did worsen those very real economic crises. We know from our own experiences in 2023 that money is not just about money. Economic crises weaken confidence in government and public morale and fuel social disorder and turmoil. In the minds of many and growing numbers of people in the mid-1780s, excessive democracy in the states, coupled with the too limited government of the Articles of Confederation, was threatening the survival of the American Republic. Now, the criticism of the states was not simply a reflexive grab of power on the part of elites, though it was a grab of power on the part of elites. It was also a measured conclusion based on experience. Many men, including James Madison, who served in the Confederation Congress, left office convinced that it was too dependent on the states, which were too much under the sway of voters. This structure, once logical in theory, was unwise, unsafe, and unsustainable in practice. There were a host of powerful patriots, nationalists, pushing for a stronger centralized government in the 1780s. Now, I have used the term nationalist, aware that it has a different meaning in the 21st century than it had in the 18th century. And that's great to teach students how terms change meaning over time. When I'm using the term nationalist in the context of the 18th century, I simply mean men who wanted a more powerful, stronger, less limited national government that would more closely bind together the states and would allow the United States to thrive economically and in the international arena. And one of the earliest and most consistent and most influential nationalists in that 18th century context was George Washington. Throughout the Revolutionary War, Washington held together a chronically impoverished army that lacked munitions, uniforms, sometimes even food. And he came to understand that that was because the army depended on a dangerously wobbly political structure. A central Congress, first the Continental Congress and then the Confederation Congress, unable to tax, weakened to the point of impotence by parochial and financially strapped states. From Washington's point of view, the central problem of the war effort derived from two factors: too much local allegiance and too little central authority. Now, the painting I have is that I'm showing is of Washington surrendering his commission to the Congress in December of 1773. He was internationally celebrated at the time and has been lionized since for this action. Even King George III said, if this is true, it makes him the greatest man in the world. A few months before the surrender of his commission, though, he had elaborated on his ideas about governance in a circular letter to the states that came out in June of 1783. And I think it was as important as the resignation of the commission. And I'm going to show you the language of his circular letter when we look at the documents. This is what it appeared as it was published widely in pamphlet form and in newspapers, and a link to the text of it from Founders Online. The letter is filled with concerns about the national character of the country and the importance of strengthening the central government so that states would not be pitted against one another and not continue to undermine the Congress. This is Washington, and I want you to think about this in the context of thinking about limited government. He hoped that Americans would cultivate a spirit of subordination and obedience to government, to entertain a brotherly affection and love for one another and for their fellow citizens of the United States at large. He had a list of priorities to keep the country really surviving. And number one was an indissoluble union of the states under one federal head. And a little further down in the essay, he urged people to sacrifice their individual advantages to the interest of the community. Washington had invited representatives from, he did the next year, invited representatives from Maryland and Virginia to meet at Mount Vernon, the Mount Vernon Conference of 1785, and he supported the Annapolis Convention of 1786. Those meetings were largely about coordinating trade. They were financially focused, but they also reflected larger concerns about states working together for the common good, a steady refrain in Washington's life. And they pointed toward a growing movement to revise the Articles of Confederation and to pivot away from limited government and move toward a more circumscribed system of representation. And that led their generation, and it leads us in our story, to the Philadelphia Convention. As pressures mounted in 1786 with Shays's rebellion, the failure yet again of Congress to raise essential funds, continued volatility within the states, crippling trade imbalances and staggering inflation, and widespread fears of fragmentation into regional confederacies or a foreign invasion, members of the Confederation Congress reluctantly and after great debate agreed to sanction a meeting of representatives of all of the states together in Philadelphia in May 1787. They were given two, it turned out, contradictory charges. One, we probably all know. The meeting was for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And it's easy to point out how the men who gathered in the room where it happened violated their charge. But the second part of that charge is important too, to make the articles adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. And it turned out that the men in the room decided they could not meet the first part of their charge without jeopardizing and undermining the second part. Richard Henry Lee was a congressman that year, and he made a prediction that we shall hear of a government not unlike the British government. This departure from simple democracy seems necessary if any government at all is to exist in North America. Indeed, the minds of men have been so hurt by the injustice, folly, and wickedness of the state legislatures that people in general seem ready for anything. And I think they probably were. Joe's going to pick up that story next week. And I hope that this helps you to help your students understand the fuller historical context of the nation's founding documents, including and especially the Articles of Confederation, and practice their critical thinking skills. I've got a few key sources on the last slide, which I'll share with you, and we can also talk about in our discussion and the Q&A. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen.